Dr. Sarah Chen had been working with the Lummi Nation's Cultural Preservation Program for 3 years before she received the call that would unravel everything she thought she understood about the temperate rainforests of Washington state. It was October 2023, and the morning fog clung to the Salish Sea like a grey shroud. Sarah's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m. Thomas Stillwater, the tribal liaison she'd worked with on ethnobotany documentation. His voice tight with something she'd never heard before. Urgency mixed with what sounded like grief. "Dr. Chen, we need you at the health center now, and bring your field kit, the DNA extraction one." "Thomas, what? Please, just come. Don't tell anyone where you're going." The Lummi Health Center sat on a bluff overlooking Bellingham Bay, a low-slung building of cedar and glass that served the reservation's 5,000 members. When Sarah arrived, Thomas met her at a side entrance she'd never used, his weathered face drawn, silver braids tucked under a wool cap against the October drizzle. "Before we go in," he said, gripping her elbow, "you need to understand something. What you're about to see, it doesn't leave this building. Not in your notes, not in your head when you're having drinks with colleagues, nowhere." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Thomas, if this is a public health issue, I have obligations. This isn't about public health. This is about a promise older than the reservation system, older than Washington statehood." His dark eyes held hers. "I'm trusting you because you've never once tried to take something from us without asking. Don't start now." He led her through a corridor past the main clinic, down a flight of stairs, to what appeared to be a storage level. The air grew cooler. At the end of the hallway, 2 tribal police officers stood outside a door marked Maintenance Storage. They nodded to Thomas, but watched Sarah with expressions that revealed nothing. Inside, the room had been hastily converted into something resembling a field hospital. IV stands, monitoring equipment, boxes of gauze and antibiotics, and on a reinforced examination table that looked like it had been borrowed from veterinary services, covered partially by a thermal blanket, was something that shouldn't exist. Sarah's breath caught. The figure was massive. She estimated 7 feet, even lying supine, perhaps 400 pounds, though the proportions were difficult to judge. What she could see of the torso showed a deep auburn pelt, matted in places with what looked like dried blood and mud. One arm extended from beneath the blanket, and Sarah found herself staring at a hand that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. 5 fingers, opposable thumb, but broader, the fingers thicker, the palm massive. The fingernails were dark, ridged, worn at the tips from what must be decades of digging, climbing, gripping. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. "Not quite," said a voice from the corner. An elderly woman sat in a folding chair, her face a map of deep lines, white hair in a traditional bun. Sarah recognized her from cultural events. Helen Stillwater, Thomas's grandmother, one of the eldest speakers of the Lummi language. "Though I suppose this is a resurrection of sorts. James, show yourself." The figure on the table stirred. The blanket shifted, and Sarah saw the face. It was the face from 1,000 grainy trail camera photos, 1,000 breathless testimonies dismissed by science. A heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes that tracked toward her with unmistakable intelligence. A broad, flat nose, a jaw that suggested both tremendous bite force and something heartbreakingly human. The skin, where visible beneath the facial hair, was dark, leathery, scarred along one cheek. The eyes, they were hazel, lighter than she expected, and they watched her with an expression that looked remarkably like resignation. "He calls himself James," Helen said. "Or rather, that's what we've called him since he was young. The name he gave us in his language doesn't translate well. It means something like walks between shadows." Sarah's scientific training warred with the impossibility before her. What happened?" Thomas moved to the other side of the table. "Logging crew found him 3 days ago, caught in an illegal trapline about 15 miles northeast of here, up in the Nooksack drainage. The trap was meant for bear, steel cable snare, the kind that's supposed to be banned. It caught his left leg." He pulled back the blanket carefully. "The leg was a disaster. The snare had cut deep into the calf. Sarah could see exposed muscle, the white gleam of what she thought might be tibia, though the scale was wrong. The insertion points of the gastrocnemius different from human anatomy. The tissue showed signs of infection, inflammation, purulent discharge, the characteristic odor of polymicrobial contamination. Someone had cleaned the wound and applied antiseptic, started an IV line into the arm. She could see the catheter taped in place, connected to a bag of saline and what looked like broad-spectrum antibiotics. The loggers called Thomas directly, not 911, Helen continued. They're Lummy boys, 4th generation. They knew the stories, they knew the protocol. Protocol? Sarah heard herself say. The Pact, Helen said. The agreement that's held for more generations than I can count. We don't speak of them. We don't reveal them. When we encounter them, we offer what help we can and keep silence. In exchange, they keep to the deep forests, avoid the settlements, maintain their own ways. They've honored it. We've honored it. But James here got careless, and now he's paying for it. Sarah stepped closer, her doctor's instincts overriding her shock. May I examine him? Helen spoke in what Sarah assumed was the Lummy language, a string of soft, throaty syllables. The figure on the table, James, turned his gaze to Helen, then back to Sarah. He made a sound, a low vocalization that had structure, phonemes, but nothing Sarah could pass. Then he nodded. It was unmistakably a nod. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled on nitrile gloves. She started with the basics, pulse at the wrist, strong, steady, perhaps 58 beats per minute, slower than human baseline. The skin under the hair was warm, maybe 97 degrees, slightly hypothermic, probably from shock and fluid loss. She pulled out her penlight and gently checked pupillary response. The eyes tracked the light, pupils constricted appropriately, neurologically intact. She moved to the leg. The wound was roughly 14 hours old, based on the tissue degradation. Someone, Thomas, she assumed, had done a decent job of debridement, but this needed surgical intervention, possibly amputation, if the infection had compromised the vascular supply. Who started the IV? She asked. I did, Thomas said. Wilderness EMT training. I've done everything I can, but Sarah, I'm out of my depth. We need to know if he can tolerate the antibiotics we're using. We need to know what his blood chemistry looks like. We need to know if he's going to make it. Sarah pulled out her field kit. I'll need samples. Blood, tissue from the wound margin for culture, hair follicles for DNA extraction. I have a portable PCR unit in my truck. We can run preliminary genetics tonight. Why? Helen's voice was sharp. Why do you need his secrets written in genetic code? Sarah met the old woman's gaze. Because if his physiology is close enough to human, I can treat him with human protocols. If it's not, everything we're doing might be killing him. Do you want him to live? Or do you want him to die with his secrets intact? The silence stretched. James made another vocalization, this one directed at Helen. She responded in Lummy, her tone almost tender. Then she nodded to Sarah. He says you may take what you need, but James says you must understand. If you save him, you become part of the Pact. You become a keeper of the silence. Can you do that? Sarah looked at the figure on the table, at the intelligence in those hazel eyes, at the hand that was so like hers and so utterly different. She thought about her career, her publications, the tenure-track position she'd been cultivating. She thought about the Nobel Prize that would certainly go to whoever proved the existence of a sister species to Homo sapiens. She thought about the media circus, the specimen hunters, the government intervention that would follow any revelation. She thought about the fear she saw in James's eyes. Yes, she said, I can do that. The blood draw was surprisingly straightforward. The median cubital vein was in roughly the same position as in humans, though deeper, protected by denser tissue. The blood was red, hemoglobin-based, she noted with relief, and flowed easily into the vacuum tubes. She collected hair follicles from the uninjured arm, swabbed the wound for culture, took photographs with her phone set to airplane mode. By noon, she had the samples running. The portable PCR unit hummed in the corner while she cleaned and redressed the wound, administered a second-generation cephalosporin based on her best guess at appropriate dosing for the body mass. James tolerated the procedures with remarkable stoicism, though she could see muscle tension and his respiration would quicken when she worked near the most damaged tissue. Thomas brought sandwiches no one ate. Helen sat in her corner watching, occasionally speaking to James, in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as a pidgin. Some lummy words, some English, some sounds that belonged to neither language. James would respond, his vocalizations complex, but his mouth and throat not quite shaped for human phonemes. At 3 p.m., the PCR unit beeped. Sarah pulled up the results on her tablet, and her hands went numb. "Oh my God," she whispered. Thomas looked up. "What?" Sarah stared at the genetic readout. He's human. I mean, not human, but the karyotype shows 48 chromosomes, not 46. But the sequence similarity in the coding regions is 98.7%. That's closer than humans to chimpanzees. Much closer. She pulled up comparison screens, her mind racing. Look, here's the FOXP2 gene region associated with language capability in humans. He's got a variant, but it's within the range of human diversity. Here's the HAR1 region, involved in brain development. Again, similar, but diverged. It's like looking at a Neanderthal genome, but not quite. A different branch, something that split from our lineage maybe 300,000 years ago, maybe less. What does that mean? Helen asked. Sarah turned from the screen. It means he's your cousin. It means he's my cousin. It means every human alive is more closely related to him than we are to any other primate on Earth. It means we share language capability, tool use, culture, memory. It means he's a person. James made a sound, a long, modulated vocalization that rose and fell. Helen laughed, a startled sound. He says, "Yes, I've been telling you that." Despite everything, Sarah smiled. Then she sobered. The infection is polymicrobial, staphylococcus, streptococcus, some anaerobes. The antibiotic coverage should work based on his physiology. But the wound is severe. If we don't get better vascular access, if the necrosis spreads, we're looking at amputation above the knee. And I don't have the surgical capability to do that here. No hospitals, Thomas said flatly. The moment he enters the system, it's over. Medical records, required reporting, imaging that gets stored in databases. We might as well call CNN. Then what do I do? Sarah demanded. Watch him die to keep the secret? There are others, Helen said quietly. His people. They have ways, healers, knowledge. James has been trying to tell us he needs to go home. But he's too weak to travel the way they travel, and we can't exactly drive him through the checkpoint at the reservation boundary. Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. How many others? Where? I don't know the numbers, Helen said. Maybe 100, maybe fewer. They range across the Cascades, from British Columbia down into Oregon. They avoid us, we avoid them. Sometimes there's contact, usually by accident, sometimes intentional, when the boundary lands shift and we need to renegotiate territory. But James is young, maybe 30 in human years. He got curious, got close to the logged areas, made a mistake. 30 years old, and he'd lived his entire life as a cryptid, Sarah thought. A ghost story, blurry photographs and derision. She looked at him, at his chest rising and falling, at the IV drip feeding antibiotics into his bloodstream, at the massive hand that rested on his chest, fingers occasionally twitching in what might have been pain or dreams. If I help him get home, Sarah said slowly, I need to document this, not for publication, for medical records, for my own understanding. So if this happens again, we're not starting from scratch. Helen considered. Private records, encrypted, never connected to external networks, never spoken of outside this circle. Can you live with that? Your whole career in genetics and the most important discovery you'll ever make gets locked in a drawer. Sarah thought about it for less time than she expected. Yes, Because the alternative is turning him into a specimen, and I didn't become a doctor to create specimens. I became one to help people. Then we have an agreement, Helen said. You're part of the Pact now, Dr. Chen. Welcome to the oldest secret in the Pacific Northwest. As the October twilight deepened outside, Sarah sat next to the examination table, monitoring vitals, adjusting the antibiotic drip, and beginning the detailed notes that would never see publication. James's breathing had steadied, the fever dropping slightly as the cephalosporin took hold. At one point his eyes opened, and he looked directly at her. She found herself speaking, not sure if he understood. I'm going to help you get home, James. I don't know how yet, but I will. You have my word. He made a soft sound, almost like a sigh. His hand moved slightly on his chest. Not quite a gesture, but Sarah had the impression he was acknowledging her. Then his eyes closed again. Helen rose stiffly from her chair. He trusts you. That's rare for his kind. They've learned the hard way that trust gets you killed or caged. But James was always too curious, too willing to see the good in people. It's what got him in this trap, and it's what might save him now. How long has your family kept this pact? Sarah asked. My grandmother taught me the words when I was 7 years old, Helen said. Her grandmother taught her. Back and back and back, through the smallpox years, through the boarding schools, through the Indian Wars, through contact with the Spanish, back to when we first came to this coast after the ice retreated. Always the same agreement. Their survival depends on our silence, and our survival has always depended on remembering we're not alone in these forests, that there are other peoples with the same right to exist in peace. Thomas checked his watch. We need to make a plan. The loggers who found him, they'll keep quiet, but they're not the only crew up in that drainage. If someone else stumbles on evidence, starts asking questions, I'll need 48 hours to stabilize him, Sarah said. After that, if we can figure out transportation to a location closer to where his people range, maybe he can signal them somehow, let them know he needs extraction. They don't use technology, Helen said. No radios, no phones, but they have other ways. Scent markers, sound patterns. If we can get James to the right valley, his people will know. They'll come. Sarah added a note to her tablet. Research olfactory communication systems in hominins, acoustic range and signature recognition. Then she looked at the three of them, Thomas, Helen, and the sleeping figure that represented everything her field had declared impossible. This changes everything, she said quietly. Not just biology, anthropology, linguistics, ethics, conservation. If people knew, Helen interrupted, there would be hunting parties in these forests within a week, federal agencies claiming jurisdiction, biotech companies trying to obtain tissue samples, media turning this into a circus, and within a generation, James's people would be extinct, either killed for trophies or captured for study, or simply unable to survive the destruction of their ranging territory once every amateur cryptozoologist with a drone descended on the Cascades. The only thing keeping them alive is the fact that the world thinks they're a myth. But they're dying anyway, aren't they? Sarah said. You said there might be only 100. That's not a viable population. Genetic bottleneck, inbreeding depression, vulnerability to disease. They're on the edge. Yes, Helen said simply. They've been on the edge for a long time. Climate change is shrinking their range. Logging is fragmenting their territory. Human encroachment is constant. They're adapting, retreating deeper, but there's only so much deeper they can go. The Pact protects them from active persecution, but it can't protect them from the slow squeeze of losing their world. Sarah felt the weight of it, the terrible, impossible knowledge that a sister species was dying in the shadows, and the only thing she could do was help one injured individual and maintain the conspiracy of silence that kept the rest alive for a little while longer. We save James, she said. We get him home, and then we figure out how to document what we can without breaking the pact, because someday, someone is going to need this information. Someday, the secret won't hold. And when that day comes, I want there to be a record that shows we knew, we cared, and we tried to protect them." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's as much as we can hope for." Outside, the October rain began in earnest, drumming on the roof, washing down the windows in sheets. Sarah checked James's vitals again. Heart rate steady at 60, blood pressure acceptable, temperature down to 99.2. The infection was retreating. Against all odds, he was stabilizing. She pulled up a folding chair and settled in for what she knew would be the first of many long nights. Her phone buzzed, a text from a colleague at the university asking about drinks Friday. She typed back a quick excuse and silenced the phone. That old life, the one with publications and presentations and the comfortable certainty of accepted scientific paradigms, felt suddenly distant. She'd stepped across a threshold into something older and stranger, a world where the maps had blank spaces, and the blank spaces were full of life that had learned to hide. Helen placed a hand on her shoulder. "Get some rest. Thomas and I will watch him for a few hours." "I'm okay," Sarah said. "I want to monitor the response to the antibiotics. If there's a reaction, there won't be. Not tonight, and you need to be sharp tomorrow. We have to figure out how to move a 400-pound patient through the most surveilled landscape on the continent without anyone noticing. That's going to require a clear head." Sarah wanted to argue, but exhaustion was a physical weight. She nodded reluctantly. "Wake me if anything changes." "We will." As she climbed the stairs back to the main level, Sarah paused at the doorway and looked back. In the dim light of the improvised medical room, Helen sat beside the examination table, speaking softly and lummy to the figure that shouldn't exist. Thomas stood at the monitor, checking readouts. And James. James lay still beneath the thermal blanket, his breathing steady, his massive form somehow fragile in the nest of medical equipment and makeshift care. Sarah thought about the trap that had caught him, about the carelessness or malice that had set illegal snares in protected drainage. She thought about the loggers who'd known immediately what they'd found and who to call. She thought about the generations of silence, the pact maintained through wars and plagues, and the relentless transformation of the landscape. And she thought about the question Helen hadn't quite asked, but had been implicit in every word. When the silence finally breaks, because it will break, Sarah was certain of that. Which side will you be on? The answer was easy. She was on the side that kept promises. She was on the side that saw a person on that table, not a specimen. She was on the side that understood some knowledge was too dangerous to share, and that sometimes the highest ethical calling wasn't to reveal the truth, but to protect it. She walked out into the October rain, letting it wash the tension from her shoulders. Above, invisible behind the cloud cover, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. And somewhere in the forests to the east, in the deep valleys and high ridges where humans rarely went, a people older than nations waited for one of their own to come home. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began making notes. Not scientific observations, not yet. Just a simple record. October 12th, 2023. Patient James, species unknown but genetically close to Homo sapiens, presenting with severe leg trauma from illegal snare trap. Prognosis guarded but improving. Objective: stabilize and facilitate safe return to indigenous population. Note: I have entered into a formal agreement to maintain confidentiality regarding patient's existence and that of his people. This is not a breach of medical ethics. This is the only ethical choice the Pact holds. I am now its keeper. She saved the file, encrypted it with a 256-bit key, and stored it locally with no cloud backup. Then she walked to her truck, pulled out the sleeping bag she kept for field work, and headed back inside. There was a couch in the staff room. It would do. Tomorrow she would figure out how to transport the impossible. Tonight, she would rest and let herself adjust to the weight of the secret she now carried. It felt, unexpectedly, not like a burden, but like an honor. She was trusted with something precious. She would not betray that trust. In the makeshift medical room, James dreamed of the high country, of the cold streams and the cedars, of the places where his people sang the old songs that had no words but carried meaning in their intervals and harmonics. He dreamed of home, and in his fever-touched unconscious, he believed he might see it again. The rain continued, the night deepened, and in the morning they would begin the work of keeping an ancient promise in a world that had forgotten how to listen. By the third day, James was sitting up. It happened gradually, first just raising his torso a few degrees to take water from a cup that Thomas held to his lips, then propping himself on his elbows, finally leveraging himself fully upright with Sarah's guidance and a series of grunts that might have been pain or determination or both. The fever had broken. The wound, while still serious, showed healthy granulation tissue. The antibiotics were working, but communication remained fractured. Sarah had started a notebook, paper, pen, nothing digital, where she catalogued every vocalization, every gesture, every attempt at mutual understanding. James's vocal apparatus was capable of remarkable range. He could produce sounds from deep in his chest that resonated like a contrabassoon, and high-pitched whistles that probably carried for miles in the forest. But the phonemes of English, or Lummi, seemed to give him trouble. His tongue was thicker, his soft palate differently positioned. When he tried to imitate simple words, they came out slurred, approximated, like someone with severe dysarthria attempting speech. But he understood. That was clear. When Sarah said water, he would gesture to the cup. When Thomas said pain, James would indicate his leg. Receptive language was intact. Expressive language was the barrier. On the morning of day 4, Sarah brought a sketchpad and charcoal pencils. James watched with interest as she drew a simple stick figure, then pointed to herself. "Sarah," she said. She drew another figure, pointed to him. "James." He reached for the pencil. His hand dwarfed hers, the fingers careful as he took the charcoal. For a moment he just held it, testing the weight, the texture. Then he bent over the sketchpad. The first drawing was startling in its precision. Not a stick figure, but a detailed rendering of a face, Sarah's face, capturing the slight asymmetry of her jaw, the angle of her cheekbones. He'd been watching her, learning her features. Helen, who'd arrived for the morning shift, made a sound of appreciation. "He's an artist, many of them are. They mark their territories with symbols, pass down stories through pictographs. It's one of their primary forms of communication." Sarah turned the page. She drew a simple scene, stick figures in a forest, a building representing the health center, an arrow pointing from James to the forest. "Home," she said. "Do you want to go home?" James studied the drawing. Then he took the pencil and added details. The stick figures became more elaborate, some with long hair, some with shorter. He drew what might have been children, smaller forms clustered around larger ones. He drew trees, but not randomly scattered. He created a specific pattern, marking certain trees with X symbols. Then he drew something that took Sarah a moment to recognize: a ridgeline, mountains in the distance, a valley between. "He's showing us where," Thomas said. "Those marks on the trees. Boundary markers, maybe?" James tapped the valley emphatically, then touched his chest. "That's where your people are," Sarah said. "That's where we need to take you." James nodded. Then he drew another scene. A vehicle, a road, barriers. He drew X symbols over the vehicle. "No, not that way. He's saying we can't drive him there," Sarah interpreted. "Too risky, too many checkpoints, or too exposed." James was already drawing again. This time he sketched what looked like a river, a winding path through forest, and finally a cave or overhang. He pointed to himself, then to the cave symbol, then made a gesture, hands cupped around his mouth, and a low, resonant sound that echoed in the small room. Helen leaned forward. "He's saying if we can get him to a specific location, he can signal his people. They'll come for him." "How far?" Sarah asked. She drew a sun, then another sun, then held up fingers. "How many days?" James considered. He held up 3 fingers, pointed to the valley on his map, then made a walking gesture. 3 days' walk for him, Thomas said. Through terrain we'd need a week to cross with climbing gear. But he can't walk, Sarah pointed out. Not on that leg, not for weeks. James made another sound, this one frustrated. He drew rapidly, showed himself on the ground, then other figures carrying him. He pointed insistently to the cave symbol. His people will carry him the rest of the way, Helen said. But we have to get him close enough, out of the lowlands, into the territory where they range. Sarah pulled out her phone, opened an offline topographic map she'd downloaded. Show me, she said, holding it out. James studied the screen with interest. His finger, remarkably deft despite its size, traced along the map. He followed the Nooksack River drainage upstream, past the markers for Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, deep into the wilderness area. Finally he stopped, tapping a location about 40 miles northeast of the reservation, in a roadless area, accessible only by trail or helicopter. That's 2 days hard hiking from the nearest trailhead, Thomas said. And that's for us. Carrying him? Impossible. What about horses? Sarah suggested. He'd crush most horses. We'd need draft animals. And getting them there without permits, without being seen. Helen was quiet, her eyes distant. Then she said, "There's another way. The old way. We used to have trails through the high country that connected to the interior tribes, trade routes that predated the reservation system. Some of them are still passable, if you know where to look. And there are places where my people still go for traditional purposes. Vision quests, plant gathering. We have permission. We wouldn't be questioned." "How long would it take?" Sarah asked. "With James? 4 days, maybe 5. We'd need to move at night, rest during the day. We'd need to carry enough medical supplies to manage his wound, and we'd need people we trust absolutely." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know who to ask. There are maybe 6 people on the res who know about the Pact. All of them elders, all of them trustworthy. But Sarah, this is where it gets real for you. Once you go into the back country with us, you're not just keeping a secret. You're actively participating in something that has no legal framework. You're transporting an undocumented person, an endangered species? Either way, if we're caught, we're all going to federal prison." Sarah looked at James. He was watching her, those hazel eyes steady. In 4 days, she'd learned to read some of his expressions. Right now, he looked resigned. He expected her to back out. Why wouldn't she? She was the outsider, the newcomer to this ancient agreement. "I'm in," she said, "but I need to understand more. About him, about his people. If I'm going to be part of this, I need the full picture." Helen nodded. "Then it's time you learned what we know." The lessons happened in the quiet hours, while James rested and healed. Helen brought out materials Sarah had never seen, despite 3 years working with the tribe. Oral histories recorded only in the memories of elders, traditional knowledge that was never written down for fear it would be stolen, codified, exploited. "We call them Tselexwistan," Helen said. "In English, that's closest to the forest people or the people who walk in shadow. But those translations lose the nuance. The term carries meaning about relationship, about shared territory, about the agreement to coexist without interference." "How long have they been here?" Sarah asked. "As long as we have, maybe longer. The oldest stories, the ones that go back to when the ice was still retreating, speak of them. They were here when the first humans crossed the land bridge, or maybe they came the same way. Different paths from the same origin. The stories say we're cousins, not metaphorically, but actually related, different branches of the same tree." Sarah thought about the genetic analysis, 98.7% similarity. A divergence maybe 300,000 years ago. "The stories are right," she said quietly. Helen continued. "They're not animals, that's important to understand. They have culture, language, social structure. They bury their dead. We've found their burial sites in the high valleys, stone cairns that go back centuries. They use tools, though simple ones. Fire, but only when they're far from human settlement. They pass down knowledge through generations. They have names, relationships, history. They're people. Why haven't they developed more complex technology?" Sarah asked. If they have our cognitive capacity, because technology requires visibility, Thomas interjected, requires trade, specialization, population density. They chose survival over advancement. Every time they light a fire, they risk being seen. Every time they create a permanent structure, they risk leaving evidence. Their entire culture is built around remaining hidden. That doesn't leave much room for metallurgy or agriculture. But they have art, Sarah said, remembering James's drawings. They have remarkable art, Helen confirmed. Pictographs in caves that will never be catalogued by archaeologists because we don't reveal the locations. Complex symbolic systems. And music, they have songs that can carry information across miles. Warning songs, territorial songs, mourning songs. It's how they maintain cohesion across a population that never gathers in groups larger than family units. How large is their range? Sarah asked. Historical range was probably most of the Pacific Northwest, from northern California to southern British Columbia, from the coast to the eastern Cascades. Now, maybe a tenth of that. The coast is too populated. The eastern forests too dry, too exposed. They're being squeezed into the high wilderness areas, and those areas are shrinking every year. And their population? Helen's face grew grave. We don't know exactly. Encounters are rare. But based on what James has tried to tell us, what others have communicated over the years, maybe 60 individuals, maybe fewer. They're at the edge of viability. One bad winter, one epidemic, and they're gone. What about genetic diversity? That's the crisis, Thomas said. They know it too. James is here in part because he was scouting, looking for potential mates outside his immediate kin group. The populations are fragmented, the northern group in British Columbia, the central group here in the Cascades, maybe a remnant group down in Oregon. They can't safely travel between territories anymore. Highways, cities, surveillance. They're isolated breeding populations. That's a death sentence, Sarah said. Even 100 individuals isn't enough. 60. They'll be extinct within 2 or 3 generations. Yes, Helen said simply. That's why some of them are getting desperate. Why James took risks. Why we've had more encounters in the last decade than in the previous 50 years. They're dying, and they know it. The weight of it settled on Sarah. She was participating in the preservation of not just an individual, but an entire species in its last days. And the very act of preservation required secrecy, which meant no conservation efforts, no protected habitat, no genetic rescue. Has anyone tried to help? She asked. I mean, systematically. How? Thomas said. The moment they're acknowledged, they're endangered. The Endangered Species Act would require habitat protection, which means surveys, which means exposure. Game cameras everywhere, researchers, regulations. The government would want to do a census, a health assessment. Best case scenario, the TSLX-Weston spend the rest of their existence being studied to death. Worst case, they end up in captivity for their own protection, or someone decides they're too dangerous to have wandering around suburban watersheds, or a biotech company gets involved. No, the only protection is invisibility. Then they're going to die, Sarah said flatly. Probably, Helen agreed, but die free, die as themselves, not in a zoo, not in a lab. And maybe, they last long enough for the world to change, for people to be ready to know without destroying. That's all we can hope for. On the 5th day, Sarah began teaching James a simple communication system based on American Sign Language, modified for his hand structure. He picked it up with startling speed. By evening, they had established basic vocabulary: food, water, pain, yes, no, help, thank you, danger, home. But it was the more complex exchanges that fascinated Sarah. When she signed family, James responded with a series of gestures she hadn't taught him, his people's own sign language, intricate and fluid. He showed her signs that indicated different relationships: mother, father, sibling, mate, child. He showed her signs for different types of terrain, different seasons, different activities. She recorded everything in her notebook, sketching the hand positions as best she could. This was linguistic data that would never be published, phonetic analysis that would never appear in journals. But she documented it anyway, because someday someone might need to know that the Sasquatch had developed a sophisticated gestural language that was optimized for communication across distances and in conditions where vocalization was dangerous. "Your people," Sarah signed slowly, then drew a question mark. James's expression changed. He picked up the charcoal again and began to draw. Not stick figures this time, detailed portraits, an older female with graying hair, deep-set eyes like his own, a scar across one shoulder. He touched his chest, then pointed to her. Mother. A male, even larger than James, heavy-browed, arm extended in what might have been a protective gesture. Father. Smaller figures, siblings, Sarah guessed. 5 of them. He drew them in a landscape. A valley with a stream, trees marked with symbols, caves in a cliff face. This was his family's territory. This was home. Then his hand moved to the corner of the page, and he drew other figures. Smaller, 3 of them, close together. His hand hovered over them, and Sarah saw his fingers tremble. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that needed no translation. Loss. These 3 were gone. "I'm sorry," she signed. Inadequate, but what else could she say? James made a sound, not a vocalization for communication, but something raw, involuntary. Grief. Then he returned to the drawing of his living family and tapped it insistently. He needed to get back to them. They would be searching for him, worrying. "We'll get you there," Sarah signed. "Promise." James studied her face, then signed back, a gesture she'd taught him. "Thank you." On the 6th day, Helen returned with the others. 6 elders, 4 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 60 to what Sarah guessed was nearly 90. They came quietly through the same side entrance, and they gathered in the makeshift medical room like a council. Helen made introductions. "This is Michael, Joseph, Patricia, Ruth, David, and Robert. They are the current keepers of the Pact within our tribe. Each of them has had contact with the Sasquatch at some point. Each of them knows the cost of breaking silence." The elders studied James with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. Ruth, her white hair in long braids, approached the examination table. She spoke in Lummi, and Helen translated. "She says she remembers when there were more of them. When she was young, they would sometimes leave gifts at the forest edge, berries, herbs, a carved stone, small things, a sign of respect. She hasn't seen a gift in 30 years. James responded with a sign gesture, then a vocalization. Helen listened, her face carefully neutral. Then she said, "He says his grandmother remembers your gifts, says the Sasquatch still speak of the time when the boundary was clear and both peoples honored it. He says thank you for keeping the memory." Ruth touched James's hand briefly, a gesture that seemed to surprise him, then stepped back. Michael, the youngest of the elders, spoke in English. "We have supplies ready, food, water, medical equipment, camping gear. We're staging it to look like a traditional plant-gathering expedition, which gives us cover for extended backcountry travel. We have 4 pack horses, mixed draft breed, can handle mountain trails. We leave tomorrow night." "Tomorrow?" Sarah said. "Is James ready?" She checked his vitals. Heart rate normal. Temperature 98.4. The wound was healing faster than she'd expected. Maybe some aspect of his physiology she didn't understand. Maybe just youth and overall health. She removed the bandage carefully. The tissue looked remarkably good. The infection was gone. Granulation tissue filled the wound bed, and epithelial cells were beginning to migrate across the surface. He'd need another week before he could put weight on the leg, but for passive transport he was stable enough. "He's ready," she said, "but we need to be careful. If the wound reopens, if he develops compartment syndrome, if—" "We know the risks," Joseph said quietly. "But we also know the risk of keeping him here. It's been 6 days. People are starting to ask questions about why the health center's storage level is off limits. We've had close calls with delivery personnel. The longer we wait, the greater the chance of exposure." Then we go, Sarah said. What do you need from me? Everything you know about his medical needs, Michael said. Dosing for pain management, signs of infection, wound care protocols. We'll have basic wilderness medicine training, but you're the specialist, and we need you to come with us, at least for the first 2 days, until we're sure he's stable. Sarah had expected this, but hearing it stated plainly made it real. My leave is up in 3 days. I'll have to call in sick. Can you? Yes, I have the days. She'd been hoarding leave for months, planning a research trip that now seemed absurd. What was a research trip compared to this? Helen spoke to the group in Lummi, a long string of sentences that Sarah couldn't pass. The elders responded, a conversation that flowed around her. Finally, Helen turned to Sarah. We're going to perform a small ceremony. It's traditional when someone joins the circle of keepers. You don't have to participate, but I want to, Sarah said. The ceremony was simple. The elders formed a circle around her, James watching from the examination table. Helen spoke in Lummi, her voice taking on a rhythmic, formal quality. Then she switched to English. Dr. Sarah Chen, you have seen what others deny. You have chosen protection over fame, silence over science. You carry now a burden that many have carried before you. You are Tselexwisten Swelitem Steksu, keeper of the forest people. Do you accept this responsibility? I do, Sarah said. Do you swear to keep their existence secret, to offer help when asked, to honor the boundary between their world and ours? I swear. Then you are bound by the Pact. May you carry it with wisdom. Each elder placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. When they finished, Sarah felt different. Not physically, but in some intangible way. She was part of something now, part of a chain of knowledge and protection that stretched back centuries. It felt heavy and frightening and strangely comforting. James made a sound, low, resonant, sustained. The elders fell silent. Sarah realized he was singing, or something like singing. No words, just a rising and falling melody that filled the small room and seemed to vibrate in her chest. It went on for almost a minute, complex and beautiful and utterly alien. When he finished, Ruth was crying. Helen's eyes were bright. What was that? Sarah asked. A gratitude song, Helen said quietly. It's how his people mark important agreements. He's accepting you, formally, in his culture's terms. Sarah approached the examination table. James held out his hand, palm up. She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, calloused, the palm crisscrossed with scars from a lifetime in the forest. His fingers closed gently around hers, a grip that could crush but was careful, restrained. A promise answered with a promise. I'll get you home, she said, knowing he understood at least the intent, if not every word. James made a sign, one she'd taught him. Trust. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Sarah assembled a comprehensive medical kit, antibiotics, pain medications, wound care supplies, a portable IV system, a field suture kit, emergency epinephrine. She included diagnostic tools, a pulse oximeter, a blood pressure cuff, a thermometer, everything packed into waterproof cases that could be loaded onto the pack horses. Michael brought clothing, large enough for James, generic enough to not be distinctive. Just in case, he said. If we run into anyone on the trail, he's a tribal member dealing with injury. Large guy doesn't talk much. It won't hold up under scrutiny, but it might buy us time to get away. Thomas showed Sarah the maps. We'll follow the Nooksack drainage to here, he pointed, then cut east into this valley system. It's technically part of the wilderness area, but there's an old trail that tribal members can access under traditional use permits. We'll travel at night, use the horses to cover ground. With luck, we'll be at the drop point in 4 days. And if we're not lucky, then we improvise. But Sarah, you need to understand, once we're out there, we're committed. No calling for rescue, no GPS breadcrumbs, no contact with the outside. We're essentially smuggling a cryptid through federal land while pretending to gather medicinal plants. If this goes wrong, it goes very wrong. I understand. Do you? Thomas's gaze was steady. Because in the moment, When you're exhausted and scared and we're hiding from a trail maintenance crew or a ranger patrol, that understanding might waver. I need to know you're solid. Sarah thought about it. Really thought about it. She was risking her career, her freedom, potentially her life. For what? For one individual of a dying species, for a secret that maybe should be revealed, for a pact she'd entered into without fully understanding the consequences. But then she thought about James singing his gratitude song, about the intelligence in his eyes, about the fact that he was a person, not a specimen, about the fact that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't the same. I'm solid, she said. Let's get him home. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat with James, monitoring vitals one last time, making notes on his care that she'd transfer to the others. He was awake too, watching her work with interest. On impulse, she pulled out the sketch pad. Tell me about your people, she said. Your family, your home. I want to know. James took the charcoal. He drew for almost an hour, covering page after page. He drew the valley where his family ranged, a place Sarah tried to match to the topographic maps, somewhere in the high country south of Mount Baker. He drew their shelters, not caves, but carefully constructed lean-tos using fallen logs and bark, positioned in locations that were naturally sheltered and hard to see from above. He drew their food sources. Fish from the streams, shown with remarkable anatomical detail. Species Sarah recognized as rainbow trout and Dolly Varden char. Plants she could identify. Salmon berries, huckleberries, bracken fiddleheads, camas bulbs. He drew hunting scenes, deer taken with what looked like primitive spears, one figure approaching from downwind while others drove the prey. He drew social scenes that broke Sarah's heart with their normalcy, adults with children, teaching them to fish. Two large figures engaged in what might have been play fighting or actual conflict. Hard to tell. A circle of individuals around a small, carefully controlled fire, faces turned toward each other in what could only be conversation. You have a whole world there, Sarah said softly. A whole culture we'll never know. James looked at her. He signed, Remember. I will, he promised. Whatever happens, I'll remember. I'll make sure someone knows, not to exploit, not to destroy, just to know that you existed, that you had names and families and art and songs, that you were people. James touched his chest, then reached out and gently touched hers. Same. We're the same. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, she said, we're the same. She returned to the drawings, cataloguing each one in her mind. This was ethnography that would never be published, anthropological data that would remain locked in her encrypted files. But it was important. It mattered. The last drawing was different. James drew two groups of stick figures, one obviously human, one obviously Tselexwisten. Between them, he drew what looked like a line or barrier. But at one point the line was crossed by two figures, one from each side, hands extended toward each other. The Pact, Sarah said. James nodded. Then he drew something else. A symbol, concentric circles with lines radiating outward like a stylized sun or star. He tapped it emphatically. What does that mean? Sarah asked. James picked up her hand and pressed her finger to the center of the symbol. Then he pointed to himself, then to her. He made the sign for trust, then remember, then a sign she didn't know, something that involved placing both hands over the heart. I don't understand, Sarah said. James tried to vocalize, struggling with the phonemes. Keep, safe. Keep you safe? Sarah asked. He shook his head, drew a circle encompassing both his figure and hers in the sketch, pointed to all of it, the drawings, the notebook, the room, the pact. Keep safe. Keep the secret safe, Sarah understood. Keep your people safe. Yes, I will. We all will. James settled back, seeming satisfied. His eyes closed, and within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Sarah sat watching him. This impossible person, this walking contradiction of everything her field had taught her. She thought about tomorrow night, about the journey ahead, about the fact that she was about to break approximately 17 federal laws to help him get home. And she thought about the symbol he'd drawn, The crossed circle with radiating lines, it looked a little like a compass rose, a little like a medicine wheel, a navigation symbol, or maybe a promise symbol. She sketched it carefully in her own notebook, then added a note, symbol given by James, meaning unclear, but related to keep safe, preservation of the Pact, appears to be significant in T.S. Alexwiston culture. Query: is this a general symbol or specific to this situation? Outside, the October night was clear for once. Through the high window, Sarah could see stars. Somewhere under those same stars, James's family waited, searched, worried. "We're coming," she whispered to the darkness. "We're bringing him home." In his sleep, James made a soft sound, almost like a sigh. His hand twitched, fingers curling as if reaching for something. Sarah wondered what he dreamed. Probably the high country, the cold streams, the taste of wild berries, and the sound of his family's voices calling across the valley. Tomorrow night, they would begin the journey to make those dreams real again. Sarah closed her notebook, checked the IV one last time, and settled into the chair. She'd sleep here tonight, stay close, make sure he was safe until they could get him to a place where his own people could take over the care. The pact held, the secret remained. And in a few days, if everything went right, one more person of the forest would return to the forest, carrying with him the story of humans who kept their promises. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself and closed her eyes. In her mind, she was already walking the dark trails, already feeling the mountain cold, already listening for the sound that would tell them they'd been successful. The call of James's people coming to take him home. The work of the Pact was never finished. It just continued, generation to generation, keeper to keeper, promise to promise. And now she was part of it. For better or worse, for the rest of her life, she was a guardian of the impossible secret that walked in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was an honor. It was a burden. It was, she realized, exactly what she'd become a scientist for, not to catalog the world, but to protect it, not to expose every secret, but to keep the ones that mattered. She slept. The convoy left at 2:37 a.m. on a moonless October night. 4 tribal members on horseback, leading 4 pack animals loaded with supplies that could plausibly pass as plant-gathering equipment. Sarah rode near the rear, uncomfortable in the saddle, despite the brief lesson Thomas had given her. Ahead, wrapped in blankets and secured to the largest pack horse, a massive draft-quarter horse-cross named Thunder, James rode in silence. They'd sedated him lightly for the transfer from the health center to the staging point, enough to dull the pain without compromising his alertness. Sarah had protested, but Michael had been insistent. "If something goes wrong during loading, we can't have him panicking." A startled T.S. Alexwiston could hurt someone without meaning to. The medication is a kindness to everyone. Now, 3 hours into the journey, James was fully awake and enduring the ride with what Sarah could only describe as stoic misery. Every jolt sent visible tension through his frame. But he didn't vocalize, didn't protest. He simply gripped the pack frame and bore it. They followed the Nooksack River drainage, using logging roads that had been gated for the season. Thomas rode at the front with bolt cutters and keys that probably shouldn't have existed but did. The benefit of 3 generations of tribal members working for the Forest Service. They cut through gates, passed through, and carefully locked them again behind them. To any observer, the gates would appear undisturbed. By dawn, they were 12 miles in and 1,000 feet higher in elevation. The old-growth cedars began to dominate, trees that had been saplings when the first European explorers arrived. The horses picked their way along trails that were barely trails, game paths, ancient routes that predated the park system. They made camp in a hollow below the ridgeline, sheltered by a rock outcropping and screened by dense hemlock. Sarah helped Thomas and Joseph set up a camouflage tarp shelter, while Michael and Patricia tended the horses. Ruth and David worked on getting James comfortable. No easy task given his size and injury. Sarah checked his vitals once he was settled. Heart rate elevated, expected from pain and stress. Blood pressure slightly high, temperature normal. The wound looked good, no fresh bleeding. She administered antibiotics and pain medication through the IV port they'd maintained. "How are you feeling?" she signed. James responded with the sign for pain and tired, then added a sign she'd taught him. "Okay." He was managing. "We'll rest during the day, move again tonight," she signed. "2 more nights, then you can signal your family." James nodded. He pulled out the notepad Sarah had given him and drew quickly, a ridge formation that she thought matched the topography about 20 miles northeast. He pointed to it, then made the sign for home. "Almost," she signed back. "Almost home." They slept in shifts, 2 people always awake and watching. Sarah took the noon watch with Ruth. The older woman sat with her back against a cedar, eyes scanning the forest, hands busy with what looked like a basket-weaving project. "You do this often?" Sarah asked quietly. "Travel like this?" "Not like this, but we come to the high country several times a year, to gather medicines, to maintain the old sites, to remember." Ruth's hands moved steadily, weaving strips of cedar bark into intricate patterns. "And sometimes, when we're very lucky, we see signs of the Tz'elexwisten, a footprint in the mud, a tree marked with their symbols. Once, when I was very young, I saw one watching me from across a valley, just standing there still as stone. I waved, the figure waved back, then it was gone." "Were you afraid?" "No. I'd been taught the stories. I knew they were relatives, not monsters." She glanced toward where James slept under the shelter. "He's young, impulsive, but he has a good heart. You can see it in how he tries to communicate, how he worries about causing trouble. His people raised him well." "Ruth," Sarah said carefully, "what happens when they're gone? When the last one dies?" The old woman's hands stilled. "Then a part of the world dies with them. A way of being human that's different from ours. A language, a culture, a perspective we'll never fully understand. The forests will still be here, but they'll be emptier, less alive. Is there really no way to save them?" "You mean, besides what we're doing right now?" Ruth resumed her weaving. "There might have been once. If contact had happened differently. If the first European settlers had recognized them as people instead of monsters or myths. If we'd had treaties that included them, protection that acknowledged them. But that didn't happen. And now the only protection is obscurity. The moment they're known, they're finished, either from people who want to kill them or people who want to save them. Both are deadly." Sarah knew she was right. She'd seen what happened to populations that became conservation priorities. The intensive management, the GPS collars, the genetic sampling, the habitat restrictions, all well-intentioned, all ultimately constraining. The Tz'elexwisten would go from free people to managed wildlife in a single generation. "Then we keep the secret," Sarah said, "for as long as we can." "For as long as we can," Ruth agreed, "and we hope it's long enough." The second night's travel was harder. The trail became a scramble, the horses struggling on steep grades and loose rock. Twice they had to unload James and lower him down cliff sections using a rope system that made Sarah's hands shake. But James endured, and the horses were sure-footed, and by dawn they were above 4,000 feet, deep in the wilderness area where even rangers rarely patrolled. The morning revealed a landscape transformed. They were above the dense forest now, in the zone where trees were sparser, where alpine meadows opened between groves of subalpine fir. Mount Baker was visible to the north, her glaciers gleaming in the early light. Below, the valley system spread out like a map, green and grey and blue, wild beyond measure. "This is their country," Thomas said, standing beside Sarah and looking out over the expanse. "This is where they've survived, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Hard for them, impossible for us." Sarah could see why. No roads, no trails, no infrastructure, just raw terrain, steep, rugged, unforgiving. The Tz'elexwisten had to be incredibly adapted to survive here. Strength to cross the ridges, endurance to handle the elevation, knowledge to find food and shelter in a landscape that offered both sparingly. How do they handle winter? She asked. Move to lower elevation caves, probably. Places where they can wait out the worst weather. They don't migrate far, can't, with how fragmented their range is now. So they have to know every shelter, every resource patch, every safe route. James has probably memorized thousands of details about this landscape that we couldn't even perceive. As if hearing his name, James stirred. Sarah went to check on him. The wound was holding, but she could see exhaustion in his eyes. 2 nights of rough travel had taken a toll. 1 more night, she signed. Then we rest. Then you call your family. James managed a weak sign. Thank you. They made camp in a cirque below a cliff face, a place that felt ancient and protected. A spring trickled from the rock, creating a small pool before disappearing into the meadow. The horses drank gratefully. The humans filled water bottles and began the work of setting up a more permanent camp. This time, Sarah slept heavily, dreamlessly. When she woke, it was late afternoon, and the light was golden across the meadow. Someone had started a small, nearly smokeless fire, just enough to boil water for coffee and rehydrate some of the food supplies. James was awake, propped against a rock, sketching in the notepad. Sarah joined him. "What are you drawing?" she signed. He turned the pad. It was a map, more detailed than anything he'd shown before. She recognized Mount Baker, certain valley systems. But he'd added markers she didn't understand, symbols at specific locations. She pointed to them quizzically. James pointed to one symbol, concentric circles. He made the sign for home, then pointed to several other locations with the same symbol, family territories. At least 7 of them, scattered across maybe 500 square miles of wilderness. Then he showed her a different symbol, 3 lines like a tree or fork. He made the sign for danger, then pointed to these markers, danger zones, places to avoid. "Why dangerous?" Sarah signed. James drew what looked like a trail, then stick figures with what might have been backpacks. Hikers. Then he drew a cabin. Then, chillingly, he drew what could only be trail cameras. "You avoid places with humans and cameras," Sarah interpreted. "These danger markers show where your people have encountered too much human activity." James nodded. Then he drew something else. A timeline, she realized. He showed the danger markers spreading year by year, the safe zones shrinking. His hand moved faster, agitated. The final image showed the home symbols compressed into a tiny area surrounded by danger marks. "You're running out of space," Sarah said aloud. James made a sign, both hands pushing inward, compressing. "Yes." Sarah studied the map with a growing sense of despair. The Tisa-Lexwiston weren't just dying from small population size. They were dying from habitat loss, the slow constriction of their range as human activity expanded into every valley, every drainage. Trail systems, climbing routes, backcountry skiing, scientific surveys, all innocuous in isolation, all collectively fatal for a people who needed vast, empty territory to survive. "I'm sorry," she signed. Inadequate, but honest. James put the notepad down. He was quiet for a long moment, then he began to vocalize. Another of those songs, but different from the gratitude song. This one was minor-keyed, mournful, a melody that seemed to echo the wind across the peaks. When he finished, there were tears on his face. Sarah understood. This was a mourning song, for his lost siblings probably, for his people's future, for the world that was slipping away despite every effort to hold on. She sat with him in silence because sometimes that was all you could do. Bear witness, acknowledge the loss. Remember, the 3rd night was the last push. They left the horses picketed in the meadow with enough food and water for 2 days, long enough for the humans to return, or for the horses to break free and find their way down if something went wrong. James traveled on foot now, supported by Michael and Joseph on either side, his arms across their shoulders. It was slow, agonizing work. Sarah could see the pain in every step he took, but he insisted. They were close to the location he'd marked. He could manage. They reached the spot at 3 a.m., a high valley below a distinctive notch in the ridge, exactly where James had indicated on the map. The valley was pristine. Alpine meadows, clusters of stunted fir, a stream braided through the grass. Above, the stars were brilliant in the thin air. James pulled free of his supporters and stood swaying for a moment. Then he made a gesture. Back away. Give him space. The humans retreated to the tree line. Sarah watched as James positioned himself in the center of the meadow, his silhouette dark against the starlight. He tilted his head back, and he sang. This was different from the other songs. Louder, more complex, with a carrying quality that seemed to fill the entire valley. It rose and fell, repeating certain phrases, varying others. A calling song, Sarah realized. A signal that would tell his family where he was and that he needed help. He sang for perhaps 5 minutes, then stopped. Silence rushed back in. They waited. Nothing. James sang again, this time a slightly different variation. More urgency in the tone, more repetition of what must be his name or identifier. He stopped, listened. Still nothing. He sang a third time. Sarah could hear the desperation creeping in, the fear that maybe his people weren't close enough, maybe they wouldn't come, maybe... A sound answered from the ridge to the north. High, clear, a vocalization that matched James's in structure but differed in pitch and phrasing. An answer, an acknowledgement. James sagged with relief. He responded, a shorter call. The voice from the ridge answered again, joined now by a second voice from a different direction, then a third. They're coming, Thomas whispered. They're triangulating on his position. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of James calling periodically, the answers growing closer. And then, at the edge of the meadow, figures emerged from the trees. Sarah's breath caught. There were 3 of them moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for being so large. The lead figure was female. Sarah could see the morphological differences. The slightly less robust build, the mammary tissue evident despite the body hair. Behind her came 2 males, one younger, one older. They stopped at the meadow edge, perhaps 50 yards from James. The female made a vocalization, questioning, Sarah thought. James responded, his voice breaking. He took a step forward and nearly collapsed. The female rushed forward, crossing the meadow in seconds, and caught him. She supported his weight easily, cradling him, making soft vocalizations that sounded unmistakably like comfort, like relief, like love. The 2 males approached more cautiously, their eyes on the humans at the tree line. Sarah could see calculation in their expressions, wariness. They positioned themselves between the female and James and the potential threat. "We need to back away," Ruth said quietly. "Show them we're not a danger." They retreated deeper into the trees, giving space. The older male watched them go, then turned to James. The reunion was something Sarah would remember for the rest of her life, the way the 3 newcomers touched James, examined his injury, vocalized what could only be questions and reassurances. The way James gestured toward the humans, making signs, clearly explaining. The female, his mother, Sarah was certain, looked toward where the humans had retreated. She made a gesture, hands pressed together, then opened outward. "Thank you." Then she made the symbol James had drawn, the crossed circle with radiating lines. A promise. "She's acknowledging the pact," Helen said softly. "She's saying they remember. They'll honor it." The Tesselexwisten worked quickly. The younger male produced what looked like a travois from somewhere. Prepositioned, Sarah realized, probably cached at various points in their territory for emergencies. They positioned James on it carefully, secured him with woven fiber straps that looked handmade. The older male picked up the front of the travois, the younger took the rear. The female sang out once more, a different song, probably signaling all clear to others who might be watching. Then they started to leave. James turned his head, found Sarah in the tree line. He made a sign, just one. "Remember." "I will," Sarah called back, not caring if her voice carried. "I'll remember, all of it." The female made one more gesture toward the humans, that same symbol, the crossed circle, a promise renewed. Then she turned and followed her family into the trees. Within seconds, they were gone, vanished into the landscape as if they'd never been, taking James with them. The humans stood in silence for a long moment. "It's done," Thomas finally said. "He's home." Sarah felt tears on her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. "They're real," she said. "They're people, and they're real, and they're dying." "Yes," Helen said, "but not today. Today, one of them survives. One family is whole again, that's all we can do. One person at a time, one encounter at a time. Keep the pact, offer help, protect the secret." "And when the secret can't hold anymore?" Sarah asked. Helen looked out at the empty meadow. "Then we hope we've taught enough people to see them as family instead of specimens. We hope the documentation you've made, the records we've kept, will help someone understand how to protect them without destroying them. We hope the pact has roots deep enough to survive in some new form." The return journey took 3 days. Without James to slow them, they made better time, though Sarah felt the absence like a wound. She kept thinking of details she should have documented, questions she should have asked, observations she should have made. But she also knew that some knowledge wasn't meant to be captured. Some truths lived only in experience, in the memory of a starlit meadow and a family reunion that shouldn't have been possible. When they reached the reservation, Sarah went immediately to the health center. She needed to see the room where James had been, needed to confirm it was real. The room was empty, cleaned, all equipment removed. No evidence that anything unusual had ever happened there. She went to her truck and retrieved her encrypted notebook. That night, in her small rented house, she wrote the complete account. Every detail, every observation, every moment of the journey. She included James's drawings, her medical notes, the genetic analysis, the vocabulary they'd developed. She wrote about the pact, about the history Helen had shared, about the map showing shrinking habitat and spreading danger zones. When she finished, it was dawn. She encrypted the files with military-grade security, backed them up to 3 separate offline drives, and hid them in locations she committed to memory. Then she destroyed the physical notebook page by page, watching it burn in her fireplace. The knowledge remained, but the evidence was reduced to ashes and encrypted files that would look like random data to anyone without the keys. A week later, Sarah returned to her university office. Her colleagues asked about her sick leave. "A stomach bug," she told them, believable because she'd lost weight and looked exhausted. She threw herself into her regular work, the ethnobotany research that was her cover and her genuine passion. But she couldn't forget. She found herself studying primate evolution differently, looking at the fossil record of hominin diversity with new eyes. Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Denisovans, Neanderthals, a world where multiple human species coexisted. That world hadn't ended in deep prehistory. It existed still, barely, in the high valleys of the Pacific Northwest. She began a second line of research, quietly, carefully. Conservation genetics, minimum viable population sizes, habitat corridors. Not for publication, but for understanding. If, when, the Sasquatch were finally revealed, someone would need to know how to protect them. She would build that knowledge base, encrypted and hidden, a resource for a future where the Pact evolved into something new. She also began mentoring students differently. She taught them about indigenous knowledge systems, about the ethical dimensions of research, about the difference between discovery and exploitation. She never mentioned the Sasquatch. That was not her secret to share, but she tried to cultivate the mindset that would allow someone to encounter the impossible and respond with protection instead of appropriation. 2 years later, Sarah received a package at her university office. No return address, but the postmark was local. Inside was a piece of cedar bark, with something drawn on it in what looked like charcoal. The symbol James had shown her, the crossed circle with radiating lines. And below it, a handprint, Large, unmistakable, undeniably non-human. There was no note, but Sarah understood. It was a message from James, delivered through the chain of Pact keepers. I remember. You remember. The agreement holds. She hung the bark in her home office, hidden from casual view, but where she could see it when she worked. A reminder, a promise, a secret kept. 5 years after the October night when she'd first met James, Sarah attended a tribal gathering on the Lummi Reservation. Helen Stillwater had passed away the previous winter, and they were holding a memorial. Sarah went to pay her respects and found herself surrounded by people who'd been part of that impossible week. Thomas, Ruth, Michael, the others. After the formal ceremony, Ruth pulled her aside. "Helen left something for you," she said. She handed Sarah a small cedar box, beautifully carved with traditional Lummi designs. Inside was a journal, Helen's personal diary, written in a mix of English and Lummi, and paper-clipped to the first page a note. "Dr. Chen, you are the first outsider in 2 generations to enter the circle of keepers. You kept your promise. Now I entrust you with the complete history as much as we've preserved it. Learn it. Teach someone else when the time comes. The Pact must continue. The Sasquatch still range in the high country. Their numbers continue to decline, but they persist. James survived, married, has a child now. 1 more generation, 1 more thread of survival. Someday, the world will change enough that they can be known without being destroyed. Until then, we keep silence, we keep faith, we keep the Pact. You are Sasquatch swelitemstex W. Carry it well, Helen Stillwater." Sarah read the note twice, then carefully placed it back in the box. She looked around the gathering, at the tribal members laughing and sharing food, at the children playing, at the elders in conversation. These were the guardians of an impossible secret, and she was one of them now. She thought about James, somewhere in the high valleys, teaching his child the old songs and the necessary silence. She thought about the map showing shrinking habitat, about the genetic bottleneck that was slowly tightening. She thought about the fact that she was witnessing the end of something, a people, a way of life, a branch of humanity that would soon be extinct no matter what anyone did. But not yet. Not today. Today, James's child was alive. Today, the Pact held. Today, the silence protected. Sarah closed the cedar box and held it close. She would read Helen's journal carefully, learn everything the elders had preserved. She would continue her quiet research on conservation genetics and habitat corridors. She would mentor her students in ethics and respect for indigenous knowledge. And someday, when she was old and the burden was too much to carry alone, she would find the right person to pass it to. The Pact would continue, the secret would hold, and for as long as it did, the Sasquatch would remain what they had always been. Not monsters, not myths, but people, family, cousins, sharing a world that barely had room for both of them anymore. Sarah walked to the edge of the gathering, looking east toward the mountains. Somewhere up there, James was alive. His child was alive, and because people had kept promises for generations, because silence had become a form of protection, they would remain alive a little while longer. "Remember," she whispered to the mountains. "I remember." The mountains, of course, kept their own counsel, but Sarah imagined she heard an answer in the evening breeze, a distant sound that might have been wind in the trees, or might have been something else. A song, maybe. An acknowledgement from the shadows where the forest people walked. The Pact held, the old agreement between cousins, between peoples who'd learned to coexist in a world that had no official space for both. It had held for generations. It held now. And with people like Sarah to carry it forward, it would hold a while longer. That was all anyone could promise. A while longer. 1 more generation. 1 more thread of survival against the tide of the modern world. It would have to be enough. If this story moved you, if you believe there are still mysteries in the forests, if you think some secrets are worth keeping, share it. Not to break the silence, but to honor it. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep exploring the boundaries between what we know and what we protect. The old pact still stand. Let's remember why.